Thanks, Tim, and to the organisers here. I've been based at the, as Tim said, I've been based at Johns Hopkins in the Public Health Department on an epidemiology training program for 2 years now, where for the past 18 months I've kind of crossed the road and I've been working with the Behavioural Pharmacology Research Unit with Matthew Johnson and Roland and the team that Tim mentioned. Specifically, I've been conducting qualitative research to study perceived mechanisms of change in an open-label pilot psilocybin-assisted smoking cessation trial. There's a couple of papers from that are going to be out this autumn. Look out for them. I also am a co-founder of the Authority Research Network, which is an international network of early career researchers interested in questions of positive power and critique, new forms of experiential authority, and questions of participatory democracy. 1 day a week I've been working on this project, which is called Participation's Others, a cartography of creative listening practices, with a colleague at the University of Cardiff. It has much more of a humanities focus, which is actually my background is anthropology, sociology. And my own research as part of this has been a comparative ethnography of psychedelics use across clinical research, the underground psychonautic scene, and traditional healing practices. So today I'd like to present some thoughts on a work in progress, and it's a bit reedy, I apologize for that, but I'll try and keep it like dialogical. So these are thoughts that are emerging out of this project on how anthropology and the humanities more generally can assist us in understanding psychedelics, in our understandings of psychedelics through clinical research. For me, just briefly, that includes concepts like space, which I'll return to later in the presentation, and the idea of more than human agencies, which is actually very well mined and explored in anthropology, which is kind of ironic given its focus on the anthropos, on man. Okay, so the second, so I mentioned the kind of concepts that I think maybe the humanities can offer. Methodologically, as with the earlier presentation, it's a comparative ethnography, and for me that allows comparisons and contrasts across the sites of inquiry, including the use of certain concepts, ways of conceptualizing safety concerns, practices of use, and the development of distinct but often quite overlapping knowledge bases. Okay, so there are many tropes. There are many tropes for understanding experiential changes wrought by psychedelics. One might trace a line from Henri Bergson's subtractive model of consciousness through Aldous Huxley's reducing valve to Ralph Metzner's recent work on consciousness expansion and contraction. There are models of temporary and permanent psychotomimesis, more recent digital metaphors like resetting the brain, and of course the representing of a neurally tethered psychoanalytic conceptual apparatus. In terms of connecting psychedelics with politics, the hopes from the 1960s that are most evident in folkloric retellings today suggest powerful and unitary mystical experiences would drive inevitable social and political change. As Timothy Leary put it in his so-called Politics of Ecstasy in 1970, this is a quote, "The political spectrum which has coloured social attitudes for the past 300 years has decreasing relevance today, and by 1980 will have no political meaning. The crucial variable in today's political equation is age." However, psychedelics as seeds of change did not lead to the anti-authoritarian revolutions countercultural figures such as Leary had hoped for. Indeed, the burgeoning Foucauldian literature on biopolitics has shown, as that literature has shown, the hopes to escape the constraints of authoritarian structures and to embrace freedom in vitality in life have themselves been turned into today's shackles, governing, regulating, and disciplining in the very name of freedom. But a second reason I think politics cannot emerge from the radical authority of one experience, no matter how profound, is because politics inheres in bodies, habits, modes of association. It requires practices and is centered upon values and commitments. It's not their precursor. It's thus dangerous to build a politics, to bind a politics to one single experience, even and perhaps especially if it's a superlatively powerful one. So in the rest of this presentation, first I will suggest that rather than chase a unitary, revolutionary, mystical experience, we might do better to broaden the discussion to ask what psychedelics do. In the process, I'll make the case for the usefulness of the concept of space, in contrast with the Bergsonist emphasis on time. Then I'll propose three kinds of spaces produced through our encounters with psychedelics that I think critical theory can help us to think through. The making of environments that reveal a kind of politics, interpersonal spaces as instructive of new relations of trust and authority, and phenomenal spaces revealing a special kind of self-teaching. One of the enduring definitions of psychedelic drugs has been as non-specific amplifiers of awareness. That's Stanislav Grof, whose experiences depend almost entirely on set and setting, where drug, set or mindset, and setting have since come to constitute the fundamental tripartite schema in pharmacological research. According to a working theory that psychedelics are amplifying awareness in general, to take psychedelics as both the object and the means of inquiry ends up taking mindset and setting as the object, and an amplified awareness of both set and setting as the means. The psychedelics on this understanding become akin to experimental apparatuses, to be fine-tuned for sure, but after that no longer the object of inquiry so much as part of a procedure for feeling, apprehending, and learning about other things. Today's research orthodoxy suggests that at low doses, psychedelics produce psycholytic experiences that loosen up conflicts within the mind, whereas at higher doses they can produce mystical experiences. Though on that I would note, for example, Ralph Metzner's recent chapter, Spirit Medicine Practices, in his recent book, Allies for Awakening, kind of complicates that story as it's being complicated elsewhere in research. Inspired by William James's Varieties of Religious Experience and Walter Stacer's Mysticism and Philosophy, current pharmacological research has operationalized a mystical type experience as involving around 8 criteria. The singular nature of this powerful experience suggests a convergence point in everyone's experience, which can be brought about by psychedelics. However, there are cracks in the singularity of this story. As Jim Fadiman recently suggests, rather than the familiar trope of many roads or journeys up one mountain of spirituality, we might need to think instead of many mountains, each with their own peak. He illustrates this by explaining how becoming one with God is different than loving God totally, and both are different again than recognizing we're all manifestations of God. This makes sense in that it reflects rather than transcends the logic of non-specific awareness amplification. Plurality in everyday worldly experience is enhanced, not effaced. Recent research has demonstrated that mystical type experiences can be reliably induced under current university protocols, and this provides an opportunity to unpack just how singular it is. At present, the measures are reported to be fairly arbitrary. A better grasp of the diversity within mystical experience might have important implications for health and healing as this kind of scientific construct, a mystical type experience, is increasingly identified as a mediating variable in transformative psychotherapeutic change.
Sorry, could you speak up a little bit more?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Okay, not doing very well. Thanks for saying that, otherwise I'd be talking to myself. Okay, maybe I'll just hold it. Is that better?
Is it switched on? It doesn't sound
Oh.
on.
Oh no, it's turned itself off again. Sorry. Oh, it says low battery. Should I just try and speak up?
Yes.
Okay, I can do this. It's not that big. As larger studies with greater statistical power are conducted, factor and latent class analysis may offer up different criteria than those currently in vogue. Meanwhile, historian Sarah Shortall takes inspiration from Joan Scott on the left's brilliant essay, The Evidence of Experience, in departing from experience altogether, pointing instead to gendered and classed forms of labor that were required in order to create the spaces of psychedelic drugs use in the first wave of research. At the infamous Millbrook estate in New York, for example, where the research team once housed at Harvard had sought refuge by the mid-1960s to continue their experimentation on psychedelics, Shortall describes how, quote, female guests were nevertheless expected to cook and care for any children, while the men were freer to engage in drug experimentation. This kind of analysis suggests that a tunnel-visioned focus on experience can lose sight of the more structural dynamics at play of gender, class, race, and so on. Returning to the humanities' current interest in the more than human, we could refrain from trying to distill or comprehensively topologize the psychedelic experience long enough to ask the logically prior and fairly Michael Pollan-esque question, what do psychedelics do? We know they can produce powerful experiences. I suggest that another thing they've done is force us to prepare ourselves and our spaces in ways that optimize productive, safe encounters. This is a fundamental element of their non-human agency, to produce in us durable practices and modes of association that in turn produce desirable experiences. So, in beginning to document such practices through a comparative ethnography, it seems clear that while there are very many of them, what's interesting is that there are commonalities across the spaces. For instance, rituals provide powerful containers for psychedelic experiences. The question of whether rituals really work or whether they are just producing a kind of grand placebo response only serves to erode their power. The spaces are made, indeed the pharmacological notion of setting, processually understood, is about preparation, as one might make the space for hosting a dinner that involves sugar, alcohol, and caffeine, or clear up before a friend visits to drink a cup of caffeine. Such space making creates containers for the clearing out of obligations to concern oneself with other matters. It's the giving oneself of permission to have a certain kind of experience, a readying and welcoming of what is to come, inviting a potential. In this generative sense, they are spaces of promise, or spaces that promise. The spaces demanded by psychedelics also involve a time commitment and protection from interruption or distraction in a safe and trusting environment. In itself, as a requirement, this would exclude so many from the safe and supported psychedelic journeys at a time when space-making constraints require separation from the ebbs and flows of normal life. So on the left, these are two old white men. Henri Bergson has been highlighted as a potential resource during the current renaissance of psychedelics research. In particular, the idea of consciousness as subtractive offers a basis for conceiving Huxley's reducing valve as opening up conscious awareness. However, Bergson's emphasis on mystical experience through his temporally oriented philosophy of creative differentiation through time has been criticized as hopelessly romantic and ahistorical by those who prefer to spatialize and historicize experience. We might find inspiration in one such critic, Walter Benjamin, for whom experience is distinct from mere sensation. According to a Benjaminian approach, while sensations and psychedelic trips are momentary and linear, experiences are produced at the intersections of what he calls profane illumination, where one can see the mystical in the everyday and the everyday in the mystical. Psychedelic journeyers then would not be reporting back some kind of pure experience, so much as producing their experiences in the recursive interconnection of the everyday and the psychedelic. So in the time I have left, I'd like to try to explore some ideas for doing this with the help of three such intersections: the physical environment as a space for the crafting of a politics, the interpersonal as a space for the cultivation of relations of trust, and the intrapersonal as a space for the development of a pedagogy of self-teaching. The concept of space used here is not empty, but as according to the geographer Doreen Massey, is a kind of cut through myriad stories in which we're all living at any one moment. Then space is the dimension of multiplicity, of otherness. This steers study of psychedelics away from thinking in terms of linear progression to ask, how does an attention to space make evident the shaping of encounters with otherness? So the first space is setting. Fairly formulaic university settings are emerging across North America. At the Johns Hopkins Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit, this entails lamps offering soft lighting, colorful paintings adorning the walls, flowers, cushions and rugs with textures and patterns, a sofa with pillows and blankets for participants to lie on, and a large bookshelf bursting with picture books on art and nature. Turning electronic devices off and leaving timekeeping to the guides is a way of ensuring that space is protected from interruption. The limits of the space-time of the psychedelic sessions combine the trope of the laboratory, which is all about insulation and being cut off from the uncontrolled complexity of the outside world, with the trope of a sacred space, where limits become thresholds of experience, as we're taking the rest of the day or the next day off is essential, perhaps not just for accurately remembering the experience, but in actively constituting it in its greatest meaningfulness. Together, these two tropes combine in the notion of the ideal clinical space as what is often referred to as a living room-like setting. A point I want to emphasize here is that in this space making as political is that it requires the crafting of knowledges of protection and refusal. Spaces for using psychedelics are made in practices that include but also exclude. Interruptions and distractions are refused entry, as are negative interpersonal energies, such as by establishing trust and affection beforehand. Some psychonautic preparations place sacred objects not just at the center of the space, but at the edges, much as gargoyles face outwards protecting a space. Familiarizing oneself with them is to know the boundaries and thresholds of a space, to know where it's separated from its outsides. Psychedelics using practices might be understood as offering a kind of separatist politics here, in which the key challenge is to trust in refusing entry, something that's difficult to do in broader societal contexts, which are normatively invitational, accepting, and about connecting. In order to make common spaces for psychedelic journeys and insights, learning to say no is vital. I would say this theme of separation is noticeably underplayed in a mystical experience-inspired politics that emphasizes interconnection and coming together. The second space, could call it interpersonal space. Here the guide-participant relationship is central and has been in the resurgence of clinical research. At Johns Hopkins, after at least 8 hours of preparatory sessions with the guides over the preceding days and weeks, and often in the same session room, the levels of intimacy between participants and their guides rival what participants have reported having with their spouses. During sessions, participants lie down with eye masks, listening to music through headphones, while their two guides, preferably male and female, sit with them, holding the space. Such deep levels of care and attention, together with a focus on aesthetics and comfort within the session room, massively enriches the overall ecology of the research space. This recognition of the importance of preparation and context might reveal a new kind of pharmacological practice, reorienting its most basic problematic from consistency, which might suggest sterile, white-walled laboratory contexts, to the cultivation of a relationship of trust and intimacy. With regards to psychonautics, Ralph Metzner explains the key requirement for participants in an entheogenic ceremony, as with a wilderness or mountain exploration or individual psychotherapy, is that they need to be able to trust the guide or therapist with whom they're engaging. And if they don't, then first work on whatever else it is in them or in the guide that blocks such trust. In my authority research network, we've theorized how authority inheres in relations of promise across gaps of knowledge and experience mediated by affect and trust. The granting of authority, then, might take place amongst tentative hypotheses, imaginings, or mysteries, as when a psychedelic naive participant imagines the wealth of experiences of their guide, or an apprentice shaman acknowledges the mysteries glimpsed by their teacher. Perhaps akin to psychotherapy, it's tantalizing to imagine inverting the narrative of the current clinical trials, from one in which guides are secondary to an encounter between a participant and a psychedelic, to one in which the psychedelic experiences are secondary to the development of a unique relationship between a guide and a participant. Of course, as long as those relationships themselves are not fully documented, it's difficult to pass out their effect, especially given that guides are considered an essential part of safety protocols, so don't get judged by their absence. This may be a fruitful point on which to compare and contrast with psychonautic practices, where the setup might entail no guides, but peers looking after one another. Okay, finally, the phenomenal space, which I'm interested in as a space of pedagogy. Dennis McKenna has told of how his brother used to play a game with him to conclusively determine whether one could learn something one could not possibly have known beforehand by taking psychedelics. Terence McKenna himself wrote of non-human entities he encountered that communicated through fabricating objects out of thin air. And in relation to that, I'd recommend Martin Ball's piece on Reality Sandwich, the blog, suggesting that the problems of language and communication, more than any real entities, were what Terence was conjuring during those DMT trips. Meanwhile, anthropologists such as Michael Tausig are unambiguous in stating that the power of ayahuasca comes from the very fact that it's a great liar. The problem then is how to understand the lessons that psychedelics teach. In the interviews I've conducted, in significant life-changing sessions, what seems to be reported most often is a coming to appreciate something that was already known, rather than something completely new. Borrowing from the queer theorist Eve Sedgwick on the left, we might suggest participants shift from knowing something to realizing it, not only manifestly but very deeply. This profound realization of what was already known before has been described as a shift from a vector-type awareness, which admits a point of view, to a field-type awareness, wherein awareness saturates the subject and objects of experience. The concept of fields here comes from William James in combining bodily sensations, sense impressions, memories, thoughts, feelings, desires, and determinations of the will to describe fields as, quote, a teeming multiplicity of objects and relations. The tensions between all the elements of this teeming multiplicity, then, are what seem to be brought into awareness through the psychedelic experience. I think it's useful to think of relations of the self to the self as another type of authority relation being produced here, wherein a space is opened between ineffable experiences and subjects who cannot fully subsequently overcode them through structures of signification. It could be that the figure of the bodhisattva helps to explain the relationship of authority gained through the psychedelic experience as the figure who returns to the world to live with compassion in the name of the enlightenment of others after a revolutionary event arouses its awakening mind. Describing field awareness in terms of the production of an authority relation between the self and one's bodhisattva, or the self and wiser self, as Ralph Metzner has it, is suggestive of psychedelic experiences establishing a pedagogy. A pedagogic relation is different than a politics, though it can help to begin one. It consecrates a relation of teacher-student, where here I suggest powerful yet mysterious and or ineffable experiences take the role of teacher as well springs of knowledge to continue to return to ponder and derive new profane illuminations from for years afterwards. Within the divination practices of shamans and some psychonauts, the spirits of animals are understood as called upon precisely because animals have differentially solved the problem of motility, while the spirits of plants and fungi are also called upon because all have solved the problem of living. It's not then surprising that they can teach us ways of moving when we are stuck and ways of enduring when we cannot bear to live. So, in conclusion, I'd emphasize that experimenting with ways of sharing psychedelic experiences, of course, occurred in the 1960s. But with hindsight, I'm wondering if an overemphasis on mystical experience eclipsed other important facets of psychedelic experiences, facets that had turned away from grandiose notions of revolutionary politics and towards more modest experimentations with bodies bring to light. Recognizing that spaces for making psychedelic experiences are shared is important for countering individualism when working through the political implications of psychedelics use. It also opens up practices of use to a variety of thinkers and ideas, not just in relation to psychedelics, but in relation to other techniques for altering consciousness that are being researched afresh today too. Meaningful interdisciplinary dialogue is hard, but the potential for as full a research agenda as possible going forwards is exciting, where science and the humanities can co-provoke new arenas of investigation, not limited by any particular paradigm. And then some acknowledgements for that. The training program I'm on at Johns Hopkins, the BPRU at Johns Hopkins, including Matt and Roland and the team, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded the Participatory Traditions Others projects that I mentioned at the beginning. Okay, thank you.